I'm Mark Hagle, and I was the chairman of the committee that wrote the ordinance prior to this one that you're looking at today, that George just commented on. I'm also, along with my wife, the founder of the Winter Park Live Oak Fund, so we've been planting trees in Winter Park for some time, so we have a little bit of history on what it takes to do this in this city. A little bit of background on the tree ordinance as it exists today. As George said, Mayor Strong asked us to come together and see if we could finalize this and write an updated ordinance, and we did it. And there was considerable debate at the time that ordinance was written. And it really comes down to a very simple issue, and that's property rights versus the rights of the community. And clearly there's two schools of thought on that. And I think we have to respect everybody that's here today, everybody that worked on both the old ordinance and the new ordinance. It's not easy devoting your time to the city, and I appreciate all the efforts that everybody's put into it. I also appreciate the property rights efforts and the property rights outlook because I'm a real estate developer, and if there's anybody that is encouraging property rights, it's a real estate developer. That being said, I think we're looking at a unique situation here. And it was referenced in the letters that I wrote that started this whole thing. And I'm glad we're having these meetings because I think it's a very important issue relative to the city. The trees are a unique situation in that that's what makes Winter Park. That's what's creating our property values here. That's what's making Winter Park unique from the most part the rest of the state of Florida. Winter Park has a tree line that it's very proud of, and it spends a lot of time and money trying to maintain that tree line. And you've seen the interest in that over the years for various issues that have been brought in front of the City Commission. What we're looking at here is a shift in the paradigm that's associated with that, and that is that when the tree ordinance that's presently on the books was adopted, we did consider property rights, we did consider the rights of the community and the historic nature of the trees and the importance to the community, and there was considerable debate on that issue. Pete Weldon was on that committee. He's also on the committee that is rewriting this ordinance, and Pete is a very strong property rights advocate. I have great respect for Pete. In fact, I supported him very strongly when he ran for City Commission. He's a good person, he has a good mind, we just don't agree on this particular issue. And we didn't agree on it at the time that the old ordinance was written. Out of everybody on the committee, he was the dissenting vote. When it went in front of Planning and Zoning Commission, in front of City Commission, it was unanimously adopted at both levels there as written, that sits on the books today. And our thought behind it was that, you know, a tree, a 30-inch tree takes about 75 years to get there. Is that right? Okay. The average homeowner stays in a house 7 years. So you're looking at 7 generations or 8 generations of people living in that house. And if one person along the line says, you know, I don't want that tree there, let's get rid of it. That's maybe 7 generations or 8 generations prior to him that have lived with that tree, and all of a sudden one person decides, I don't want it, and it's gone. That impacts the city. And I understand the property rights, but that was the kind of discussion we had at the committee level on maybe a tree is different than other property rights. Maybe the trees that are in Winter Park and the importance to Winter Park change it to more of a community interest rather than a property rights interest. So you have to look clearly at those two schools of thought, and the commission's going to have to evaluate that and set a direction for the future. The previous commission agreed with our approach. And I'll get into some numbers and calculations in a second because the ordinance we passed at that time is not perfect. I do think it needs to be modified. I think there's some things that have been learned through its use that should be corrected. I think in some areas it is unfair to the homeowners, and maybe that could be adjusted, but not to the extent that it is. I think there's a good compromise in certain areas, and I think that needs to be looked at. For example, I had my back to the person who was talking about the math, but I also, thank you, I was also doing some math, but I was doing it on the area of the tree, not just the diameter replacement. And it's even more dramatic when you look at it that way. Under the existing ordinance, if you take out a 9-inch tree, and I'm just going to rattle numbers here, it'll be more meaningful when I do my summary at the end of it. That's 63.58 square inches of tree that you're taking out of the ground. So it's the area that's being taken out of that tree, not just the cross-sectional diameter. in the ordinance as it stands says you're gonna replace that same area of trees. If you take out that much, you're gonna put that much back in the ground. So it's a one-for-one replacement of the area of the tree. Under the new ordinance, or the proposed ordinance, excuse me, they're saying you're gonna plant 1 3-inch tree, which means you're gonna take out 63.58 inches and you're gonna put 7.06 inches back in. You're gonna put 9.8% of what you took out. Less than 10% of what you took out is being replaced. That's not fair to the city on a couple levels. It's not fair to the city on the immediate impact to the city, and it's also not fair to the city on the number of years it's gonna take for that 3-inch tree to become a 9-inch tree again. Little background on the size of trees. There's been some discussion on why 4.5, why 3 and everything. The Live Oak Fund, when we started planting trees, and it was after the hurricanes came through 6, 7 years ago, I don't know what it was, we've planted somewhere around 750 trees in the city, replacing the damage that was done by the hurricanes. We started out by putting 2 different sized trees in the ground, a 4.5-inch caliper tree and a 6-inch caliper tree, and we found by watching those trees over the years that it did not make sense to spend the extra money to put the 6-inch. The 4.5 was the one to put in. Now, a 4.5-inch caliper tree is a tree that's about 20 feet tall and has a spread of about 10 to 15 feet. A 3-inch tree is a tree that's about 8 to 10 feet tall and has a spread of about 3 feet. So I disagree that it overtakes a 4.5-inch tree in that few years, because I've watched the growth in the city. And that's why, first of all, I don't think 3-inch trees are the way to come back, because you're taking trees out that have some impact on the city, and in essence, putting a bush back in the ground, and I'm exaggerating to make a point, and please accept that as an exaggeration, Woody. I don't mean to discredit anything you've done. Now, if we start looking at the larger caliper trees, a 20-inch, you're taking out 314 inches in area. And under the ordinance as it stands today, you're putting back in exactly that same area of tree. Under the new one, you're putting back in 14.12 inches, or only 4.5% of what you took out. Again, that's not fair to the city. I think we need to look at some reasonable approach on putting it back. Now, I had an opportunity to talk to Woody today, and he made a very good point. Not everybody can afford these kinds of things. There are people that have hardship cases. And there are people that I can absolutely understand and relate to that just can't afford to do some of the things that we're asking here. That's why the appeal process was put in place. We're not trying to penalize the person that can't put the tree in the ground, but in talking to Woody today, and I haven't attended the meetings, I haven't sat in his chair, so I don't have a feel for this the way he does. If a person comes in and they can't afford to do what needs to be done, well, maybe that's the decision to not take the tree out of the ground. Maybe it's not that important to them all of a sudden. So that's good. It's discouraging the tree from being pulled out of the ground and being replaced. If it's something that's important, if they need to build a new house or expand a house, or it's something they want to do and they should be able to do that, well, maybe they can't pay it all at once. Maybe the board can give them some latitude and have them pay it over time. Or the board certainly has the discretion to reduce the number. Woody commented today that a person came in with a hardship case, and they had to pay, what was it, the $6,000 number, something like that? And before the board had a chance to react, the person said, but I can pay $3,000. Well, the board was willing to give them even less than that. The hardship cases can be handled under the existing ordinance. What we have to be careful of here is that we don't play to the lowest common denominator. We can't write an ordinance that's designed for the person that can't afford it. We need to write an ordinance that's designed for the protection of the city on this particular issue, because the trees are important to the city, but leaves the latitude for a group like the Tree Preservation Board to allow that hardship case to be able to solve the problem and do it in such a way that's fair to both the person and the city. Now, when we start going to the larger numbers, and this is where I think maybe when we wrote the old ordinance, we overstepped our position. If you take out a 30-inch tree, and I was using the examples that were put together on this chart that George did some time ago. If you take out a 30-inch tree, you're taking out 706 square inches of area. And under the old ordinance, where you have to replace double the caliper of the tree, or double the diameter, which is 60 inches if you take out 30, then you're having to put back 2,826 square inches of replacement, or more to the point, 400% of what you took out. Well, maybe that's not fair. Maybe when we did our arithmetic, we were looking at just the diameter of the tree, and we weren't necessarily looking at another way of looking at it. So maybe there's some latitude where that one can be carved down to a smaller number. But under the new ordinance, you're taking out 706 square inches, and you have choices of either 3-inch or a combination of 3 and 4. And if you look at the two combinations, on one hand, you're putting back in 28.28 inches, or 4% of what you took out. Or in the other alternative, you're putting back 37.07 square inches, or 5.2% of what you took out. That's not fair to the city. I think in this respect, clearly, it's being written at a lowest common denominator and overcompensating for the person that can't afford it, to the point that the person that can afford it is getting a windfall here. And then, of course, the 50-inch example, I think it certainly needs to be rewritten, because where we said 3 times, you're taking out 1,962 square inches, and you're putting back 17,000 and change, or 900% of what you took out. Well, maybe we overreached there, and maybe that needs to be redone. The math is simple. It's just a matter of calculating it and deciding what is a fair replacement. Under the proposed ordinance, you're only putting back in 31.78 square inches, or 1.62% of what you took out. That's not right. It's not right at all. So I appreciate the approach, and I appreciate the property rights, but I don't think it's fair to the city. And I really think the city commission, when they consider these things, need to consider those numbers. Now, as far as the amount of monetary compensation associated with it, again, the people have the ability to appeal these numbers, but I think the numbers need to be significantly high, that we are discouraging people from taking trees out of the ground. It has to be done under circumstances where there's a real reason to do it and a real need to do it. And if the person can't afford it, the Tree Preservation Board has the latitude to either schedule the payments over time or to reduce the payments. But I think you'll find, for the most part, that the people that are wanting to take trees out for an expansion or a renovation are already spending a significant amount of money for that expansion renovation. And if you look at the cost of handling the tree problem relative to the new house cost, it's an insignificant number, and it could easily be absorbed in the cost of building the house. So those are my thoughts. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you very much. I think the perspective that you provided here certainly added a lot to the thought process, at least for myself.
Sure.
The two questions that I have is one around maintenance. Very seldom do we hear about tree maintenance raised in this dialogue. And the challenge is that, you know, we all know that the canopy is important. We all believe that it's an integral part of Winter Park. But the maintenance of the trees is I think, an issue. And that, coupled with the discretionary removal of a tree, and the removal of a tree that is somewhat hazardous. In some of the areas, we live in one of them that was basically an oak grove 12 or 15 years ago.
Sir, could you speak a little louder?
Sure.
I'm having trouble hearing you, and I know
12 or
it's very
15 years ago,
interesting.
a whole lot of trees were taken down. There's a lot of trees standing there.
Jack, it's being recorded, so you might want to have your question
Okay.
at the microphone.
The first part of it is there's no address to the maintenance of the tree. And let me address that, and then we'll go on to the other part. We learned with the Winter Park Live Oak Fund that with the Parks Department input, that in order for a new oak tree to take root and survive, it takes 1 year of solid watering, and it takes an intensive watering, particularly in the early months, or the tree just isn't going to root and isn't going to take ground and isn't going to survive. And there's a significant cost associated with that. With the Live Oak Fund, when we're putting 4.5-inch trees back in the ground, it's costing us, and of course we're buying in bulk here, but it's costing us $450 per tree to buy the tree and put it in the ground. It's costing about that same amount to water it for the year, is that right? So there is a significant number associated with that. Of course, if you're a homeowner, it wouldn't cost as much. You just need to take your hose out, lay it in the trunk of the tree, and make sure that the water gets there. But it is very important, and if it's not done, the tree won't survive. Another thing associated with the maintenance is, there was an article written, and I'll have it available for the commission at the commission meeting and maybe prior, that if you put an oak tree in a new oak tree or in an existing oak tree is allowed to get to this state where more than 50% of the canopy of the tree is shaded, the tree's gonna die. And it's irrecoverable at that point, once that starts happening. And this was a study that was done by a professor at some university who's smarter than all of us here combined. And that leads us to believe that if we are gonna plant these smaller trees, particularly the 3-inch trees that are so small in size that they don't reach up into the sunlight, the chances of them surviving, if there's any shade being put in from the ambient area, the chance of them to survive is very little, and there's nothing you'll do in maintenance that's gonna make it work.